Hello everybody, I'm George from Ireland. So I'm speaking here because it's the house of the late Keith Joseph behind me. You can see that black door there, and there's a blue plaque beside it. That's number 63 Portland Place, London. I filmed it before because the blue plaque is for Frances Hodgson Burnett, famously authoress of Little Lord Fauntleroy. But I'm not here to speak about her. So about Keith Joseph, who was perhaps the foremost conservative thinker, British conservative thinker of the 20th century, certainly the late 20th century. So he was born in this house in the billiards room in 1918. So the First World War was still raging. He was born into a Jewish family, but much of the Jewish community in this country was still working class at this stage. His family were well established in this country, had already been here several generations, whereas many British Jews were recent immigrants from the Russian Empire, which was then extant, particularly from the Pale of Settlement, as in Eastern Poland, Ukraine, Latvia, Lithuania, Belarus. So Joseph grew up in a Reformed Jewish family who was completely Anglophone. I don't think speak any Yiddish at all. And they had an engineering firm, so they're very well to do, which is why they could afford to live on such a desirable street. And he had a number of siblings. Anyway, he went to Harrow School, which was widely regarded as the second best school in the British Empire at the time. Churchill School, no less. So he flourished there academically. He wasn't so into sports, though he was actually always quite physically fit, was never overweight, even as an old man. Serious-minded, outstanding at classics. Of course, classics was the mainstay of the curriculum back then. And I don't know if he learnt Hebrew or whatever. He certainly went through a bar mitzvah, but was not particularly observant later in life. He certainly never wore a beard, a skull cap. I mean, might have in a synagogue, donned his yarmulke, but not going around town. So he went up to Oxford in 1936 to read jurisprudence, and he graduated with a double first. I don't recall which college he went to. That was an outstanding result. Only about 10% of people would have got a first-class degree. A double first when you got them in mods, your first-year exams, as well as your finals. So just because you got a first in mods doesn't guarantee you get them in finals. So that would put him in about the top 7% of Oxford graduates at the time. He was then vivaed for All Souls. So All Souls is a college in Oxford that people can only get into by sitting a competitive examination. The top 2 undergraduates in each subject finals, 2 from Oriental Studies, 2 from Classics, 2 from Law and so on, would be vivaed for it, would have their written exam, like a 3-hour exam that was just not really a question, just one word. One of my friends who sat it, and the word she had to write about was value for 3 hours, nothing else. And then a viva voce, as in an interview really, an oral exam perhaps. And of all those 20 plus candidates each year, 2 would be selected. For 7 years, have a salary, free bed and board in All Souls, and absolutely no duties. They didn't need to stay there. They didn't even need to live in the country. But if they wanted to come to All Souls, they could spend as much time as they wanted there and give them plenty of time to get on with academic work or pursue other interests. But so he was indeed elected into All Souls. But he decided to go down to London and read for the bar. So he knew what's his name, Rouse, is it A.L. Rouse, that famous Cornish academic who spent most of his life at All Souls and talked about the Londoners, the ones who effectively lived in London, just visited occasionally on the weekend. So he was called to the bar, and then the Second World War broke out. He was in the army during the Second World War. He was a conservative by conviction. That was becoming unfashionable by the middle of the war, this sort of wartime socialism. For the sake of the war effort, the government had to assume control over huge swathes of the economy, nationalising railways was supposed to be a temporary measure, and rationing everything from food to petrol to clothing, and sequestering things under the Defence of the Realms Act. So the war came to an end, and so he went into Parliament in the Conservative interest. I forget which seat he sat for actually. He was married. He had a couple of children, but anyway, he rose up the ranks of the Conservative government. It seemed like that it was going to be really Labour in office for a generation, because Sir Hartley Shawcross, the Labour Attorney General, the one who prosecuted at Nuremberg, he said in 1945 of the Labour Party, "We are the masters now, and not just for now, but for a very long time to come." And so it appeared that Labour had won such a landslide victory. The Conservatives were smashed. The very idea of conserving things seemed to be old hat. The Conservative Party, it toyed with various ideas. Should they rename themselves the National Party or the Union Party? I mean, there was Unionist, but they didn't do that. And they did indeed flirt with such nostra after another cataclysmic defeat in 1997, that Churchill was not enough to carry them over the line. But anyway, as we see that they actually came back in 1951, very fortunate for the Conservatives, despite Labour getting most of the votes, the Conservatives got most of the seats. And so Labour was very unlucky to be pipped at the post. But 4 times in the 20th century, out of 20 elections, the party with the most votes has not got the most seats. Thrice it's redounded to the disadvantage of the Conservatives, and once to their advantage. But this was crucial, because by 1951 the country had just about recovered from wartime austerity, and they were beginning to ease off rationing, to say this item's not rationed and that item's not rationed. Obviously the last thing not to be rationed was coal, significantly in 1958. So there was 19 years of coal rationing, 13 of these years after the war, partly because the coal miners wanted to be paid a lot or not work too hard. Well, who wouldn't if you could have it that way? Because obviously coal had been nationalised, Labour had nationalised so many things. There was BHS, British Home Stores, selling furniture and clothes, British Oxygen Company, British Gas, British Telecom, British Leyland, and on and on. So he came in as housing minister in the 1950s, and the government was committed to building houses, thinking that not that the private sector should sort it out. And he began doing that. And so he's a sort of conventional conservative at the time. There was Butskillism, as in that name is a portmanteau of Butler and Gateskill, as in R.A. Butler, Rab Butler, the Conservative Chancellor Exchequer, and his Labour predecessor, Hugh Gateskill. So there was a consensus, a via media had been reached. Reminds me of Harold Macmillan, that Tory wet. In the 1930s, he'd even entitled his book The Middle Way, about a blend between socialism and capitalism. And he was, of course, becoming man in the 1950s, Chancellor of the Exchequer under Eden, and then Prime Minister 1957 to 63. So then the Conservatives were out of office in the late 60s, but Keith Joseph remained an MP. But he was very much on the bland side. He was cerebral but desiccated. And I think it was Harold Macmillan said he's the only boring Jew I've never met. Or was that Rab Butler said that of him? So then in the 70s, the Conservatives in government briefly, and he was someone who had a deep impression on Margaret Thatcher, who's only 7 years younger than him. And they were friends. No one said that there was anything romantic between them. They're both married, and there was no whispers there was any infidelity. But then in 1975, Edward Heath submitted himself to a leadership election. He'd been leader of the Conservative Party for 10 years. He'd lost 3 of the 4 elections he'd led them into. The one he'd won hadn't even really been a particularly decisive victory. So Grocer Heath decided it was a back me or sack me. Now Keith Joseph was seen to be a standard bearer for the Tory right. Some of these more free market monetarist ideas were crystallising in the Conservative Party, in a certain faction of the party by this time. Jane Ott Pole had just left the party to become an Ulster Unionist MP for South Down. But and he was a sort of a herald of this movement, of moving to more full-blooded capitalism. But in 1974, Keith Joseph had made an ill-advised speech saying that women of inferior intelligence were breeding too much. So there were too many children of these unfit mothers, and that was debasing the racial stock. Now that's ipsissima vox, not ipsa verba, but you can see how this could be used against him, and it seemed to be incendiary. So people said this was deeply insensitive and it smacked of eugenics and all the rest of it. So he was howled down, and because of these shrill, shrieking criticism of him, he decided not to let his name go forward in the leadership election, and indeed he gave his imprimatur to Margaret Thatcher. Had he gone for the leadership, would he have won it? I mean, I think not. He was decidedly lacking in charisma and wouldn't have had much appeal to the wider public, even if you concurred with his policies, because to some extent this is showbiz, as Boris Johnson understands, and they've got a warm to him as a personality. Most people aren't policy wonks. They don't understand the intricacies of policy. So Thatcher won and obviously became Prime Minister. Had he stood and won, would he have won the 1979 election? I suspect he would, because Jim Callaghan had fouled up so much for Labour, but probably not by as much as Thatcher did. But history could have been quite different. I mean, he wouldn't have made all the decisions that she made. Anyway, he eventually stood down from Parliament. I don't think he was made a peer, but he died in 1990. So that is Sir Keith Joseph. He was knighted, obviously. He didn't inherit the knighthood. One of the most formidable intellectuals in the Conservative Party, a deep thinker, but should have been more of a backroom boy. Wasn't someone to really be the face of the party. That's enough from me. Toodaloo.